In this video, I'll show you how to transform one scene into 3 different modes. After a quick tour of the scene, I'll demonstrate how to manipulate lighting and other elements to achieve our desired outcomes. Plus, stick around until the end to learn how you can get a $50 render coupon from our sponsor, Fox Renderfarm. Let's get started. We have got a 120 frame animation spanning over 5 seconds with a 35mm camera slowly moving forward. As we step out of the camera view, you can see this open field with scattered grass, which will be challenging when we start lighting the scene, because there are no big trees or any big structures to help us tell a story. That is an issue to tackle later. Now let's take a closer look at the grass. Using my favorite tool, Geometry Nodes, I created a simple setup to scatter the grass assets using vertex groups as a mask. I distributed points on the ground surface and used a collection that contains a bunch of grass assets as point instances. Then I add random scaling and rotation for some variety. Here is the full setup if you like to have a closer look. All of these grass assets are from polyhaven.com. They are completely free to download, and the best thing about these grass assets is that I can control their aging and wetness by changing a slider. The night weapon were found on Sketchfab and rigged using Mixamo. I gave it a subtle breathing animation inside Blender. For the flag, here I just used a rectangular mesh. At this moment, I wasn't sure what kind of a flag I am going for. But later, I created this texture in Photoshop and used it here. You might have already noticed that when I play the animation, our flag and these cloth pieces start waving in the wind. There's no cloth simulation here. This is also done by using geometry nodes. I created this setup that allows me to add wave motion to the clothes. The best thing about this, I can change the speed, wave amount and wind direction without breaking any cloth seams. It may not look as good as a cloth simulation, but this gives me so much more control. And if you are wondering what that GeoNode setup looks like, here's a quick screen grab. We have got a lot to cover in this tutorial. The lighting, the sky, mountain, fog, a lot. So let's start with our first scene. In our first scene, I want to give a sense of hope, a dawn of a new era kind of feeling. There's something about the start of a new day that gives that kind of a fresh perspective and feeling of endless possibilities. Picture this. The sun is just starting to peek over the horizon. It is time when anything is possible, and the world is full of promise. We'll try to capture that mood and bring it to life in this scene. But creating a convincing sunrise scene can be a challenge, especially when it can easily be mistaken for a sunset scene. As we all know, a sunrise and a sunset have distinct characteristics and evoke different moods. In this scene, we want to capture the essence of a fresh new day, full of hope and possibilities. However, achieving this can be tricky, as the warmth and vibrant colors of a sunset can easily creep in and disrupt the intended atmosphere. This is something we need to be mindful of as we continue to refine and perfect our sunrise scene. So, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work on this exciting challenge. Here I have the final scene. At the moment, I turned off almost every change I made. Step by step, I will show you what I did and why I did them. Here, I changed the location of our flag from here to here. The previous position felt like it will take unnecessary attention, especially since I want the flag to just hang from this weapon. And here, around our subject's feet, you can see these black areas. That's happening because we have a lot of transparent layers in the scene, and we don't have enough transparent bounces to render them. So Here in the render settings, I set it all the way to 10. Like I said before, I don't want my flag to wave in the wind. It gives me a sense of already existing energy. The whole goal of the scene is to give a feeling of new energy that is being creating with the sunrise. So I created a vertex group like this and add a cloth scene to the flag. Use that vertex group as pin group. Now when you play, it hangs like this. Make sure to enable collision for the ground. Once you get your desired look, with the modifiers tab, you can either just apply it or apply it as a shape key. I use the shape key method. What that does is it creates this shape key which I can use to blend between my original flag shape and the shape that the cloth scene created. This way, if I change my mind later, I can always go back to the previous shape. After that, I enable that flag waving geo setup I created and add a very slight movement to the flag. Almost none. You can see when I scrub the timeline, it is very subtle. I added a solidify modifier to give some thickness to the cloth. To deal with our world in the shade editor, go to world shader type. Here I hit Ctrl T to bring this node setup and select an HDRI image. I have imported this one, and when I plug that here, you can see it immediately made our scene 1000 times better. That's the power of the HDRIs. Then I rotated it to place the sun to the side behind the subject. I did that because in a wide shot, when a person is looking towards the sun, often it gave me that sunset vibe. You are looking into the horizon after a hard day's work, resting. But when you have the sun beaming from behind, the past in front of you is fading away. I know there could be so many other factors which decide where the sun should be, but here that's the feeling I got and I went with it. Actually, I turned down the HDRI strength to 0.5. I didn't like how much it illuminated the rest of the scene. I selected my grass assets and increased their material wetness value to 1. Although I want this HDRI to light the scene, I don't want it to be the sky. I want one with a bit more details, especially when the sky has a big chunk of the frame. You can do that in a few ways. If you want one HDRI to light your scene and another one to be visible to the camera, you can do that in the shade editor. I'll tell you how to do that later. But for now, I'm just going to use this image as my sky. You can find these high-res images from sites like Pixabay or Pexels. To bring it to Blender, make sure you have Import Images as Planes add-on enabled in the preferences. Then hit Shift-A, Images, Images as Planes, and import that sky as a plane. Here I imported it and place it way back in the scene and scale it up like 100 times to fit the frame. And place its sun roughly around the same area where the HDRI sun is. Make sure to plug the image color into the emission socket and to disable the shadow option in the object properties ray visibility settings. Also, disable everything else here except for the camera, unless you want this image to create reflections in the scene. In the same way, I imported an image of a mountain range and place it like this. By the way, when you search for the mountain images, try to find something that suits your time of the day. Especially make sure the sun is hitting the right sides of the mountains. Here I photoshopped this image a bit to get that effect, but it is better if you find a perfect one. For this one, I enable the shadow ray visibility. This way, I can use these mountains to block the sunlight to a certain part of the scene. I use 2 copies of that mountain. You can see the effect it created in the scene. After getting this basic world setup, then I added a sun lamp to the scene. Although the location of the sunlight doesn't matter to the scene, here to get the right idea of the sun's angle, I place it roughly around where my sun is from the camera view. Then rotated it until I find the right angle. Also, whenever you use the sunlight, try increasing its intensity to a higher number. It just looks right. Here I used a value of 5. And for the sunlight color, instead of using this color input, I use the nodes. Whenever you add a new light, you can see an option here to use nodes. Click on it. That's how you can enable the nodes. Then in the shade editor, you can make some advanced tricks to polish your light. Here I search for this black body node and plug that to color. This will give us a color value based on a Kelvin scale. For daytime light, this is around 5600. You can reduce it to a lower number to get more sunset kind of a light. I set it to something like 4000 just to get a bit of yellowish color to the light. Here I also have a point light near the sword blade. Initially I used this to add a bit of glare to the blade, but right now it is not doing much. I think I disabled that in the final render as well. Let's add some fog. It really helps to sell the direction of the lights. I add a cube to the scene and set the display type to bounce. Then create a new material for it. Delete the principal BSDF shader and add a principal volume shader and plug it into the volume output. Then reduce the density to around 0.01. Then scale it up to match the scene size. Here's the one I made for this scene. I gave it a bit of yellowish tint, very subtle. I set its density back to 0.01. And this anisotropy value, it gathers the volume around the light or around the dark parts of the scene depending on the value you set. Here I set it to 0.1, and you probably already noticed that I have something else in this setup. I created a gradient mask for the fog. I selected this face of the cube, put the 3D cursor there and then set the origin to 3D cursor. Then in the shade editor, I can use the object coordinates with a separate XYZ node to get a gradient like this. By the way, I didn't apply the scale or rotation when I scaled up this cube. That's important because otherwise I have to use a separate method to get this look. After that, I use a color ramp node to adjust the gradient and then multiply it by 0.01. Plug that into the density. This creates a nice gradient for the density. Near the camera, you basically have zero mist, but when you step forward, it slowly starts to get more dense. And another thing to notice is the composition of the scene. If you look at this scene, stuff like this branch is placed in a way to drive the viewer's attention towards the subject. Sunbeams coming from behind give the subject a nice rim light and create that contrast between him and the background. Even these mountains works as an invisible guideline. If you watch my recent video where I showed this simple demo, even in there, I manually placed these pieces from the explosion to drive attention towards Spider-Man. These things really help to control the viewer's attention, especially if you got a lot more going on the scene. Another way we can control the viewer's attention is by using depth of field. In camera settings, I enable the depth of field and choose the knight's helmet as the focus object and set the f-stop value to 1.4, which creates a shallow focus. You can go for a higher f-stop value, but I am a big fan of shallow focus. A bit too much actually. and I set this ratio value to 2. That way I can get an anamorphic look to bokeh. And let's talk about these birds. I created a simple bird shaped mesh and used shape keys to animate it to look like it is flying. Then in the nonlinear editor, I select that clip and add some repetitions. Then duplicated the bird object a few more times to make a flock of birds. Offset the animation strip just a bit. Then parent all of those birds to an empty object and animate its location to move the flying birds. Also, another thing to notice is they are not flying towards the sun. When birds or helicopters or anything goes towards the sun, we once again get that sunset vibe, the ending of something, which is the opposite of what we want. That's why I make sure they fly up and away from the sun. Then I modified my grass scattering setup to add some movement to the grass with the wind. I kept it very subtle. So we finished the lighting stage and now it is time for the render. For all the rendering of these animations, I relied on the powerful capabilities of Fox Renderfarm, a leading cloud rendering service. With its lightning fast and secure rendering, Fox Renderfarm supports a wide range of 3D software, renderers, and plugins. Plus, its flexible pricing options make it an excellent choice for both small and large scale projects. Not to mention, Fox Renderfarm has even been trusted to render some of the biggest titles in the industry. Check out the link in the description to get a $50 render coupon to render your next big animation with Fox Renderfarm. After the rendering, compositing is the next big thing. This thing can seriously polish your final render. For that, I much rather prefer using something like Resolve or After Effects. They are more powerful and easy to work with compared to Blender's compositing at the moment. But basically, I did was I add some glow, lens distortion, lens flare, some color grading and grain. And we ended up with something like this. For the next scene, I want to add some feel to the scene. Once again, the scene we are working with is a bit challenging because we got an open field and almost fixed camera angle and movement. So what I did was I slowed down the camera animation. I created a keyframe in the middle of the animation and dragged it to the end, cutting down the camera speed by half. This slows down the animation and makes you wait. I also brought the camera down a bit more. In the depth of field settings, I increased the f-stop value to something like 2 or 2.4. This will put a lot more of the environment into focus, giving the feeling that our character is not the only thing here. Now let's talk about the lighting. People fear what they can't see. So when doing a scene like this, I only want to show a little, just enough to give the viewers an idea of what they are, but not too much to make them feel comfortable. So there was no doubt for me to go for a night scene. For the night sky, I start with a linear gradient texture and map it to the window texture coordinates. This will map this texture to whatever the window we are viewing from. In this case, camera view. Change its mapping values to make the gradient to go from top to bottom. Using a color ramp, change it to something like this. Then I import another environment texture, Moonless Night Sky from Fantasy Sky Pack, which you can download for free from CubeBrush. This pack contains a bunch of stylized sky images. Run it through a RGB curves node to darken it a bit. Then multiply with our previous gradient to get this dark night sky with barely visible clouds. Use this as our world color, and for the strength I set it to 0.5. Also, here I have another setup. What this does is it sets two things, one for us and one for the scene. If you look at this example, here all you see is white. Let me turn off the lights. Now, although the background is white, it is not lighting up anything. That's because everything in the world sees this first input as its background color. You can see it clearly when I change the color of that input. This is a handy method if you want to use two different environment textures for your scene. One for the camera and the other to actually light the scene. A useful trick to know. But here I use the previous setup. And for the mountain, I use the same one as before but change its position. Let me increase the world's strength to show it clearly. Before it was something like this. There was this opening on the side. I dragged it to the side so that it fills more space. It makes things look more contained. It surrounds our character like no escape. And the gradient we created earlier helps to see the shape of the mountains as well. After that, I have fog, this time uniform density across the cube. Values are almost similar to the previous one, just a bit dense. Then to our most important part, lights. Nighttime lighting is very tricky and you always have to go for the Hollywood night look. Here I have added a few area lights and this sun lamp to the scene. They are just there to light the scene just a bit. They are all very low in intensity, all the way down to 10 watt and 2 watts. Here I put two of them to light the foreground. Also reduce their size to decrease their softness. This gives a slight edge light to the shapes and all of them have light blue color. Then I have this area light which gives more dramatic moonlight. I set its size to 0.1 meter. Then I created this node setup to control its light fall off. I started with this light path node. This ray length value basically gives us the distance light travels. For example, here I have about 4 to 5 meters from the light to the ground. So I take this ray length value, take its value range that goes from 0 to 5 and map it to 1 to 0, which gives here a value of 1 and all the way down here a value of 0. And we get a gradient in between these 5 meters. Then using this color ramp, I adjust the gradient more to have somewhere around these areas as black. Here to be white and here again to be black. I use the B-spline method for a smooth gradient. This way I can make the lamp have no strength at each end and around midpoint it reaches the strength of 1. Then I multiply that custom fall off to have more strength and plug that into emission strength. If we didn't have this, you can see what it does, especially when we have fog in the scene. You can clearly see where the light source is, which breaks the whole illusion. But with this custom fall off, we can create that invisible moonlight. By the way, make sure to have all these lights at the same angle because there's only one moon. Actually, you can keep the scene like this, but I went on and add this lantern to the scene and a point light to act like its light. Animate its strength. In the graph editor, you can add this noise modifier to create a flickering effect to the light. And look at that, only color Hollywood knows, orange and blue. After that, I slowed down the waving of the flag and disable the flag's waving setup. And after a bit of compositing, Now to the third and final scene, which I call Fury. This is all fantasy, nothing real kind of scene, inspired by artwork like this, a red tinted war zone. So the first thing I did was I duplicate the flags and scattered them around the scene. Then I set that shape key value to 0 and used the waving setup I created earlier to make the flags wave in the wind. Also, I increased the dead amount of the grass material and increased the waving speed of the grasses and cloth pieces. For the world, I use another environment texture from the Fantasy Sky Pack and adjust its mapping values, especially this X location value, which makes the sun bigger. Using hue saturation node, I increase the sky's saturation. Then I use the technique I showed earlier, but this time for strength. I set a lower strength of 0.2 for the scene, and for the camera I set a strength of 0.4, which makes the sky brighter without brightening up the rest of the scene. Here's what it looks like without any lights. Not bad if you are going for a silhouette look. I added two area lights, one with a bigger size and the other with a small size. The bigger one will light up the majority of the scene, a very soft light, but the smaller one will add these highlights. After that, I added this sunlight with a strength of 5 to mimic the sunlight coming from the sun in our sky. Also, I added a spotlight just to show more directionality of the light. And for the fog, I used the one I used earlier. Also, I added some particles to the scene using another geometry node setup. They are moving slowly with the wind. I used a random value to make some of those particles emissive. For depth of field, I changed the ratio back to 1 and set the blades to 5. This will give us a pentagon shape for the bouquet. Sets its rotation to 45 degrees. And that's our third and final scene. If you like to take a closer look at the project files, geometry node setups, and more in-depth info, consider becoming a Patreon member. And don't forget to check out Fox Renderfarm to get your $50 render coupon. So, I hope you learned something cool, something new. That's what we like to do. We not only create stuff, we let you create with us. Hit the like button, comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to HelloTex Learn so you won't miss out when the next video drops. Until next time.